He didn't know it yet, but the moment his hand touched her face, he ended everything he had ever built. The lobby of Whitfield Tower glittered that night the way expensive things always do, gold light pooling on marble, a fountain murmuring somewhere behind the elevators, a doorman pretending not to watch the family walk through like they owned the building. In a way, one of them did. He just didn't know which one. Evelyn Marsh walked a step behind her husband, her cream coat dress catching the light, her face arranged into the practiced calm of a woman who had spent years learning how to survive dinners like the one they'd just left. Beside her, Grant Whitfield moved like a man already rehearsing his next insult, jaw tight, hands shoved into his pockets like he was trying to keep them from doing something. He should have kept trying harder. "You made me look like a fool in there," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "In front of my mother. In front of everyone at that table. I asked one question, Grant." Evelyn's voice stayed even, almost gentle, the tone of someone who had learned that calm unsettled him more than shouting ever could. "I asked why Priya's signature was on a 7-figure vendor contract for a division she doesn't work in. That's not an ambush. That's arithmetic." Behind them, heels clicked against marble in 2 distinct rhythms. Diane Whitfield, silver-haired and dressed in pale gold silk, moved like a woman accustomed to smoothing over her son's messes before they could harden into scandal. A few steps behind her, Priya Anand hovered in a red gown that seemed to apologize for nothing, her eyes darting toward Grant every few seconds like she was checking whether the storm had passed. It hadn't. "You don't get to interrogate me," Grant said, stopping so abruptly that Evelyn nearly collided with him. "Not at dinner. Not in this lobby. Not anywhere. I built everything you're standing in." "Did you?" The question left her mouth before she could stop it. Quiet, almost curious, the kind of quiet that comes right before a door slams somewhere far away. Diane's breath caught audibly. Priya froze mid-step, one hand rising toward her throat. And Grant Whitfield, a man who had never once in his life been told no and believed it, closed the distance between them and slapped his wife hard enough to spin her sideways, hard enough that her earring shattered against the marble floor with a sound too small for what it meant. For one full second, nobody in that lobby breathed. Evelyn's hand rose slowly to her cheek. The skin beneath her palm was already burning, already blooming red, already becoming the one piece of evidence Grant Whitfield would spend the rest of his life wishing he could take back. She didn't cry out. She didn't stumble the way he probably expected her to, the way she'd stumbled through every argument before this one. Apologizing first, softening first, disappearing first. Instead, she simply stood there, breathing, her eyes lifting to meet his with something far colder than shock. "Grant!" Diane's voice cracked across the lobby, sharp with either horror or humiliation, even she couldn't have said which. "Oh my God," Priya whispered, stepping back as if the violence in the air might reach her too, her red dress trembling slightly at the hem. A security guard near the front desk, David Okafor, mid-30s, quiet-eyed, the kind of man who noticed everything and said very little, was already moving, one hand lifted, his voice low and firm. "Sir, step back. Right now." Grant looked down at his own hand like it belonged to a stranger. The anger hadn't left his face, but something else had crept in beneath it, the first flicker of a man realizing too late that a room full of witnesses does not forget. "You made me do that," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. "You keep pushing, Evelyn. You never stop pushing." "Don't," she said. One word. "Quiet." It landed harder than his hand had. She bent, retrieved the broken earring from the marble floor with fingers that did not shake, and straightened her spine the way she always did, the way she'd learned 2 years ago, back when nobody in this family believed she was worth watching closely. That mistake, she thought distantly, had always been their greatest advantage against her, and it was about to become their greatest weakness. Diane reached for her son's sleeve, murmuring something about calming down, about handling this upstairs, about family matters staying inside the family. Priya lingered near the elevators, eyes flicking toward the exit as if she could simply vanish before anyone thought to ask why she'd been standing so close to a married man's shoulder all evening, or why her name kept surfacing in places it had no business being. Evelyn looked at each of them in turn. Her mother-in-law, radiant with borrowed dignity. The woman in red, whose signatures sat quietly buried inside financial records nobody but Evelyn had bothered to read carefully. And finally, her husband, flushed, breathing hard, still convinced that whatever came next would happen on his terms. He had no idea that the company his mother worked for, the company that had just quietly approved a contract with his mistress's name on it, didn't belong to some distant board of strangers. It belonged to his wife. "Tomorrow," Evelyn said softly, turning toward the doors, "you're all going to wish you'd let me finish my question." She walked out into the cold night air and didn't look back, and somewhere behind her, in the gold-lit silence of that lobby, 3 people who thought they understood exactly who she was had just run out of time to keep pretending. The car was already waiting when she stepped outside, its engine humming low against the wet asphalt, headlights cutting soft cones through the mist still hanging over the street. Marcus, her driver for the past 6 years, was out of the vehicle before she'd crossed the sidewalk, his expression shifting the moment he saw her face. "Mrs. Marsh." "I'm fine, Marcus." She said it the way she said most things now, evenly, without inviting argument. "Take me to the Foster Street office, please." "Not home." He didn't ask questions. That was one of the reasons she trusted him. Inside the car, alone for the first time in hours, Evelyn allowed herself exactly 90 seconds. She counted them silently, watching the city blur past the window, streetlights smearing gold across the glass. 90 seconds to feel the sting radiating from her cheekbone, to feel her hands tremble faintly in her lap, to feel the old, familiar ache of being reduced, in one lobby, in front of strangers, to something small. Then she exhaled, and the 90 seconds ended, and Evelyn Marsh became, once again, the only version of herself that mattered right now. She had built Halcyon Capital Partners from nothing. Not literally nothing. She'd had an economics degree, a modest inheritance from a father who'd sold his hardware store to pay for it, and an almost frightening ability to see patterns other people missed. But she'd built it without a single dollar of Whitfield money, without a single introduction from Grant's world of country clubs and golf handshakes, and she'd built it, deliberately, in secret. When she married Grant 4 years ago, he'd been dazzled by her, or by some version of her he'd invented, a quiet, agreeable woman who worked in finance and didn't ask difficult questions. She had let him believe that. Not out of shame. Out of strategy. She had watched, in the earliest months of their courtship, the way he spoke about ambitious women at other tables, the faint curl of his mouth when a female colleague was mentioned, the way his father, long dead now, but clearly the architect of everything Grant had become, used to say a woman's job was to make her husband look good, not to compete with him. So Evelyn had made herself small. Not because she believed she was small. Because smallness, she'd learned, was sometimes the safest place to build something enormous. 3 years ago, quietly, through a chain of holding companies and a board of directors who reported to no one but her, Halcyon Capital had acquired majority control of Sovereign Regent Group, the real estate and hospitality conglomerate that ran, among its many properties, Whitfield Tower itself. The very building she just walked out of. The very company where Diane Whitfield held a cushy, mostly ceremonial position as Director of Client Relations, collecting a 6-figure salary for lunches and golf outings and vague promises of introductions to old money. The very company where, 6 months ago, Priya Anand had been quietly hired into the events and hospitality division, a hire Evelyn now suspected had far less to do with qualifications than with something else entirely. Grant had no idea. Grant, who considered himself the smartest man in every room, had never once thought to ask what, in finance, actually meant, had never once looked closely enough at his wife to notice that the woman he dismissed at dinner parties was quietly, patiently becoming one of the most powerful people in his own family's professional orbit. The car pulled up outside a slate-gray building with no signage, no logo, nothing to suggest it housed anything more than an unremarkable investment firm. Evelyn stepped out, and the night doorman, a retired police officer named Walter, straightened immediately at the sight of her face. "Ma'am, do you need—" "I need Priyanka up here," Evelyn said, using the first name of her chief operating officer, a woman as sharp and discreet as anyone Evelyn had ever hired. "Tell her to bring the Sovereign Regent compliance files. All of them. And call Nathaniel Cole. Tell him it's urgent." Walter didn't ask who Nathaniel Cole was, though he clearly wanted to. He simply nodded and reached for his phone. Upstairs, in an office that occupied the entire top floor, glass walls overlooking a city that had no idea what was about to happen inside them, Evelyn sat at her desk and, for the first time all night, looked at her own reflection in the darkened window. The mark on her cheek had deepened to an angry red, already beginning to bruise at the edges. She touched it once, lightly, then reached for her phone and took a photograph. Clinical. Precise. Not for pity. For the record. By the time Priyanka Reyes arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a leather folio thick with printouts, Evelyn had already changed into a simple black blazer she kept in her office closet for nights exactly like this one. Nights when the woman who walked in needed to leave as someone else entirely. "Tell me everything you found," Evelyn said, without preamble. Priyanka set the folio down and opened it to a tabbed section near the middle. "It's worse than the vendor contract. Priya Anand's approvals go back 4 months. She's been signing off on catering and events budgets that route through a shell vendor called Larkspur Creative, a company registered to an address in her sister's name. The markups are small individually, 10–15% over market rate. But across 4 months and 6 major events, it adds up to almost $200,000. Evelyn's expression didn't change, though something behind her eyes sharpened. "And Diane?" Diane Whitfield's expense reports for client relations outings, golf, dinners, a weekend retreat at the lakeshore property, list attendees who, according to the guest logs, were never actually present. We're talking 11 separate events over the past year. Nearly $90,000 in reimbursed expenses for meetings that, as far as we can tell, didn't happen. "And Grant?" Priyanka hesitated just slightly. Nothing yet that ties him directly to Sovereign Regent's books. But his name appears in the building's after-hours access logs more than it should, given he has no formal role there. And there's a pattern of restaurant reservations, under a corporate card linked to his personal assistant, at locations that also appear in Priya's calendar. Same dates. Same times. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the photograph on her phone, her own bruised cheek, lit starkly by the office's overhead lights. "He hit me tonight," she said finally, her voice flat, almost clinical. "In the lobby. In front of his mother. In front of her." She didn't need to say Priya's name. There were witnesses. Security cameras. A dozen strangers with phones in their pockets. Priyanka's jaw tightened. "Evelyn. I'm not asking for sympathy." Evelyn closed the folio gently, as though sealing something shut. "I'm asking you to schedule an emergency session of the Sovereign Regent Board. Not next week. Not Monday. I want it within 72 hours, and I want Diane Whitfield's and Priya Anand's names on the agenda, quietly, formally, and completely outside their knowledge until the moment they walk into that room." "And Grant?" Evelyn looked up, and for the first time that night, something flickered across her face that wasn't calm at all. Something old, something that had been buried under 4 years of careful, deliberate smallness, finally beginning to surface. "Grant doesn't work for Sovereign Regent," she said softly. "But he's about to learn that everyone he loves does. And every single one of them has been stealing from his wife for months without knowing her name was on the deed." She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the tower across the skyline. Its windows lit gold, indistinguishable from 100 other towers in the city, except that it was hers, and tomorrow, everyone standing inside it was going to find that out the hard way. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her. A text from an unknown number, sent 4 minutes ago. "I know what you're planning. And you have no idea what I'm willing to do to stop it." Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment before she set the phone down, face first, against the desk. "Who is it?" Priyanka asked, watching her carefully. "Unregistered number. Could be anyone." Evelyn's voice stayed level, but her jaw had tightened in a way Priyanka had only seen a handful of times in the 6 years they'd worked together, usually right before Evelyn dismantled something with terrifying precision. "Trace it. Quietly. I want to know who sent it before the board meeting, not after." Priyanka nodded and stepped out to make the call, leaving Evelyn alone with the folio, the photograph on her phone, and the dull, insistent throb along her cheekbone that no amount of composure could fully silence. She thought about Grant's father first, dead 6 years now, a man named Harold Whitfield who had built the family's fortune in commercial real estate and, according to every story Grant had ever told with reverence, never once let a woman tell him what to do. She thought about how much of Grant's cruelty tonight had sounded like an inheritance rather than a choice, words passed down at dinner tables long before Evelyn had ever sat at one. It didn't excuse him. It simply explained the shape of the trap she'd been living inside for 4 years, one built decades before she arrived. Then she thought about her own mother, gone now too, who used to say, folding laundry in their small kitchen in Ohio, that some people mistake quiet for weak because they've never once had to survive on quiet alone. Her mother had been wrong about one thing, though. Quiet wasn't survival. Quiet was preparation. By morning, the bruise along Evelyn's cheekbone had deepened into a mottled purple-yellow that no amount of concealer could fully erase, though she didn't try particularly hard. She arrived at the Sovereign Regent Group headquarters, a separate building from Whitfield Tower, one Grant had visited exactly twice in 4 years and never with any curiosity about who actually ran it, at 7:15, an hour before the executive floor typically stirred to life. Nathaniel Cole was already waiting in the small private conference room adjoining her office, a compact, silver-haired attorney whose calm exterior had, over the past decade, negotiated Evelyn out of 3 lawsuits, 1 hostile takeover attempt, and, now, apparently, a domestic assault. "I need this filed correctly," Evelyn said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside, the photograph, time-stamped and metadata verified, along with a written statement she drafted at 4 in the morning, unable to sleep, unwilling to lie in the guest room of a house she no longer wanted to think of as home. "I want a police report filed today. Not to punish him publicly, I want it documented, on the record, dated, before anything else happens." Nathaniel studied the photograph without visible reaction, the same careful neutrality he brought to reviewing contracts worth 9 figures. "You understand that once this is filed, it becomes discoverable. If Grant's lawyers get aggressive during a divorce, this becomes public record regardless of what you intend." "I'm counting on it," Evelyn said. "I'm not trying to hide what happened. I'm trying to control the order in which it happens." He nodded slowly, made a note, and moved to the next item. "The board meeting. I've confirmed attendance for Thursday, 10 a.m. Diane Whitfield and Priya Anand have both been added to the agenda under Internal Compliance Review, vague enough not to raise alarm, specific enough to hold up procedurally. Neither has been told the topic." "Good." Evelyn folded her hands on the table, the same stillness she'd worn in the lobby the night before, though something underneath it had shifted, sharpened. "And the text message?" "Traced to a prepaid phone, purchased in cash at a convenience store 2 blocks from Whitfield Tower, 6 days ago." Nathaniel slid a printed report across the table. "Whoever sent it knew to buy it in advance. That's not panic. That's planning." Evelyn read the report twice, her expression unreadable. 6 days ago, before the dinner, before the vendor question, before any of it. Someone had known this confrontation was coming before she had fully decided to force it herself. "Priya," she said quietly, more to herself than to Nathaniel. "She'd have motive. If she suspected I was getting close to the Larkspur Creative Shell Company." "Or Diane," Nathaniel offered. "If she suspected the compliance review wasn't routine." "Or Grant," Evelyn said, and the name came out flatter than the others, colder. "If he's been more involved in Sovereign Regent's business than the access logs currently prove." The 3 names sat in the air between them, each one a door she hadn't yet opened. At the same hour, 20 floors above street level in Whitfield Tower, Diane Whitfield sat at her vanity, applying a final coat of lipstick with hands that were not quite as steady as they'd been the night before. Across the room, her son sat on the edge of an unmade bed, staring at nothing, still in the same shirt he'd worn to dinner, now wrinkled and faintly stained with last night's wine. "You need to call her," Diane said, not looking away from the mirror. "Apologize. Flowers. Something. Before this becomes a story people tell at parties." "I don't need advice on how to manage my own wife," Grant said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You clearly do," since you slapped her in a lobby with 40 witnesses and at least one working phone camera pointed in your direction. Diane finally turned, her expression sharp despite the softness of her tone. Grant, listen to me. Whatever's happening between you two, whatever she found or thinks she found about the Lakeshore contract, it doesn't matter if the story that reaches people first is ungrateful, difficult wife embarrasses husband, not husband loses control in public. Do you understand the difference? Grant said nothing. He was thinking, though he wouldn't have admitted it to his mother, about the way Evelyn had looked at him just before he'd raised his hand, not afraid, not even particularly surprised, as though some part of her had been waiting, almost curious, to see if he'd actually do it. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. The text from Priya. Have you heard anything from the office? My badge isn't working this morning. Front desk said IT needs to review my access. What does that mean? Grant frowned, typed back a quick reply. Probably a glitch, I'll call someone, and set the phone down, unaware that across the city, inside a slate-gray building with no signage, his wife had just authorized the very first quiet freeze of every credential Priya Anand had ever been issued. By Thursday morning, the Sovereign Regent Group boardroom on the 40th floor had been prepared with the same understated formality Evelyn insisted on for every serious meeting: water glasses, printed agendas, a single manila folder placed precisely in front of each chair, contents unknown to everyone except the 4 people who'd assembled them. Diane Whitfield arrived first, elegant in cream, faintly puzzled by the vague wording of the agenda but not yet alarmed. Priya Anand arrived 12 minutes later, visibly tense, her badge access issue from earlier in the week apparently unresolved, judging by the irritated way she asked the receptionist to buzz her in manually. Neither woman noticed, at first, the tall doors at the far end of the boardroom, or the quiet efficiency with which Priyanka Reyes was arranging documents at the head of the table, documents that would, within the hour, connect a shell company called Larkspur Creative directly to Priya's sister's bank account, and connect 11 fabricated client relations outings directly to Diane's signature. What neither woman noticed, either, was the woman who slipped in last, seated not at the head of the table where power was expected to sit, but in an unassuming chair near the window, cream blazer, composed expression, a fading bruise along her left cheekbone that she'd made no effort whatsoever to hide. It was Priya who saw her first. Her face went pale. "Evelyn," she said. "What are you?" The doors at the far end of the room opened, and Nathaniel Cole stepped through, followed by 2 members of the compliance team, each carrying a laptop and a folder considerably thicker than the ones already on the table. "Good morning," Nathaniel said, taking his seat. "Before we begin, I'd like to formally introduce Mrs. Evelyn Marsh, majority shareholder and acting chair of Sovereign Regent Group's governing board." The silence that followed was so complete that Evelyn could hear, faintly, the hum of the building's air conditioning through the vents. Diane's teacup, halfway to her lips, stopped in midair. Priya's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I believe," Evelyn said quietly, folding her hands on the table exactly the way she had in the lobby 3 nights before, "some of you already know me by another name." For a moment, nobody in the boardroom moved. Diane's teacup finally lowered, unsteadily, back to its saucer, the porcelain clicking with a sound too loud for the silence around it. Priya remained half-risen from her chair, as though her body hadn't yet caught up with what her mind was still refusing to accept. "This isn't possible," Priya said finally, her voice thin. "You're Grant's wife. You said you worked in finance, some small firm?" "I said I worked in finance," Evelyn agreed. "I never said small." Diane recovered first, the way women of her particular breeding always did, smoothing her expression back into something composed, even as her knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. "There must be some confusion. I've worked in this building for 2 years. I would know if my daughter-in-law owned the company that employs me." "You would know," Evelyn said, "if you'd ever once asked me a genuine question about my life instead of assuming you already knew the answer." She nodded toward Nathaniel, who slid a single sheet of paper toward Diane, the ownership structure of Halcyon Capital Partners, and beneath it, in smaller print, its controlling stake in Sovereign Regent Group. Halcyon acquired majority control 3 years ago. Quietly, through a holding structure specifically designed to keep my name off anything that would reach a dinner table conversation. I built that structure myself, Diane. For exactly this reason. What reason? Diane's voice had sharpened now, defensiveness climbing fast beneath the composure. So you could spy on your own family? So I could protect what I'd built from people who'd spent 4 years telling me it didn't matter, Evelyn said, and for the first time that morning, something colder slipped into her voice. As it turns out, that instinct was accurate. Nathaniel opened the thicker folder in front of him and began, without any particular relish, to lay out what the compliance team had spent the last 72 hours assembling. He started with Priya, the vendor contract for the lakeshore renovation, the shell company called Larkspur Creative registered under her sister's name, the pattern of inflated invoices stretching back 4 months, nearly $200,000 skimmed in markups small enough to avoid automatic flags, large enough to matter. Priya's face drained of color with each line item. Those numbers are wrong, there's an explanation. There usually is, Nathaniel said mildly. We genuinely like to hear it. That's what today is for. I handled vendor relationships for 6 major events, Priya said, her voice rising, cracking slightly at the edges. Larkspur was recommended to me. I didn't know it traced back to my sister's account. I never looked. You emailed your sister 11 times using the phrase, "Keep this under Larkspur, not your name," Priyanka said quietly, sliding a printed email chain across the table. Compliance pulled it from the archived server this morning. It's time-stamped. It's not ambiguous. Priya stared at the page without picking it up, as though touching it might make it more real than it already was. Evelyn watched her without satisfaction, without cruelty, simply watched, the way she'd learned to watch people over years of board meetings and negotiations, cataloging the exact moment someone's confidence gave way beneath them. Diane, Nathaniel continued, turning the folder's next section toward her, 11 client relations outings over the past year, each reimbursed at an average of $8,000, listing attendees who, according to guest logs at the properties in question, were never present. A weekend retreat at the Lakeshore Lodge billed to Sovereign Regent that coincides, interestingly, with a private booking made under your son's corporate card the same weekend. Diane's composure finally cracked, not into tears, but into something harder, more brittle. You've been watching my son. You've had someone following my son. I've had someone reading a building's access logs, Evelyn said. Grant's name appears in Whitfield Tower's after-hours system considerably more often than a man with no formal role there should require. That's not surveillance, Diane. That's arithmetic, same as it was 3 nights ago at dinner, when you all decided arithmetic was an insult worth silencing with a slap. The room went still again. You're doing this because he hit you, Priya said, some desperate instinct pushing the words out before she could stop them. This is revenge. This isn't governance. This is a wife punishing her husband's family because she's humiliated. You're half right, Evelyn said evenly. I am his wife. I was humiliated, publicly, deliberately, and physically, 3 nights ago, in a lobby with security cameras that Sovereign Regent, as it happens, also owns. That footage exists. It's time-stamped. It's been preserved by our legal team as of Tuesday morning. She let that settle before continuing. But this review didn't begin 3 nights ago. Compliance flagged irregularities in the Lakeshore vendor contracts 5 weeks ago. I asked the question at dinner because I already knew the answer, Priya. I wanted to see whether anyone in that family would tell me the truth if given the chance. And none of yous did, Diane said quietly, almost to herself. No, Evelyn agreed. None of you did. Nathaniel closed the folder gently. The board's compliance findings will be forwarded to Sovereign Regent's legal department for formal review. Ms. Anand, your access credentials are suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of that review. Mrs. Whitfield, your consulting contract is under the same suspension. Neither of you is being terminated this morning. You're being asked to account for what the documents show. What happens after that depends on what you say, and whether it matches the paper trail we already have. Priya stood so abruptly her chair scraped hard against the floor. This is insane. I want a lawyer present before I say another word. That's your right, Nathaniel said calmly. We'd expect nothing less. She gathered her things with shaking hands and walked out without looking at Evelyn again, though at the door she paused, just for a second, and said, without turning around, "Does Grant know? Does he know any of this?" "Not yet," Evelyn said. "But he will by tonight." The door closed harder than necessary behind her. Diane remained seated, staring at the folder in front of her as though willing the numbers to rearrange themselves into something less damning. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all its earlier sharpness. "He's going to blame you for this," she said. "Whatever happens to me, whatever happens to her, he's going to say you engineered it, that you set us up." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "But you were the one who told me 3 nights ago that some women simply weren't built for certain rooms." She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer, the bruise on her cheekbone catching the fluorescent light as she turned toward the door. "It turns out I built the room, Diane. I just let all of you believe otherwise for 4 years, because I wanted to see exactly what you do with a woman you thought had nothing." She left Diane sitting alone at the long table, the folder open in front of her, the quiet hum of the boardroom's air conditioning the only sound left behind. Grant found out at 6:40 that evening, not from his mother, not from Priya, but from a phone call placed by Sovereign Regent's General Counsel, a courtesy call, procedurally required, informing him that as the spouse of a majority shareholder, certain financial disclosures related to an ongoing internal review would soon require his acknowledgement. He listened to the entire explanation twice before he understood what it meant. Then he called Evelyn's phone 6 times in a row. She let every call go to voicemail. On the 7th attempt, a text arrived instead, and Grant stared at it for a long moment in the empty penthouse, the city glittering coldly beyond the windows, before he understood that the woman he'd struck 3 nights ago in a marble lobby had never, not for one single day of their marriage, actually needed him at all. "You wanted to know why I asked that question at dinner. Come to the Sovereign Regent building tomorrow morning, 9th floor. I'll finish answering it." Grant didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark of the penthouse living room with a glass of scotch he never finished, replaying the General Counsel's call over and over, trying to find the version of it that made sense, the version where his wife hadn't been quietly buying the ground beneath his family's feet for 3 years while he stood on it, oblivious, telling people at dinner parties that she did something with numbers. By 4 in the morning, the scotch had gone flat and untouched, and Grant had moved on to something worse than confusion. He'd started remembering. He remembered the early days of their courtship, 5 years ago, at a charity gala where Evelyn had worn a plain navy dress among a sea of designer gowns and somehow still been the only person in the room he wanted to talk to. He remembered asking her, over drinks, what she did for a living and the small, careful pause before she'd said, "Investments, mostly," and he remembered, this was the part that kept surfacing now, unwelcome, insistent, the flicker of relief on her face when he hadn't asked a single follow-up question. At the time he'd thought it was modesty. Now, at 4 in the morning with his hands still faintly aching where he'd struck her, he understood it had been something closer to disappointment. She'd been waiting to see if he'd care enough to ask twice. He never had. He thought about his father, too, inevitable at this hour, in this kind of silence. Harold Whitfield had built Whitfield Development out of a single strip mall in the 80s into a name that meant something in 3 states, and he had done it, according to every story he ever told at every dinner table Grant had ever sat at, by never once letting a woman's opinion slow him down. "Your mother runs the house," Harold used to say, refilling his glass. "I run everything else. That's balance, son. Don't ever confuse it for anything more complicated." Grant had absorbed that lesson so early and so thoroughly that he'd never once questioned whether it was true, only whether he was living up to it. He was still sitting in the dark, unshaven, tie discarded somewhere on the floor, when the sun came up over the skyline and he finally understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had spent 4 years married to a woman he had never actually tried to know. The 9th floor of the Sovereign Regent building was quieter than the 40th, a smaller conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river instead of the skyline. A room, Grant would learn later, that Evelyn used specifically for conversations she didn't want overheard by an entire executive floor. She was already seated when he arrived, in the same cream blazer from the day before, a single folder closed in front of her, untouched. The bruise on her cheekbone had darkened overnight into something almost black at its center, yellow-green at the edges, and Grant actually flinched, at the sight of it in daylight, without the adrenaline of anger to blur its meaning. "Sit down," Evelyn said. Not unkind. Not warm, either. He sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grant found himself staring at the folder between them, unable to guess what it contained, unable to muster the old reflex of demanding answers immediately, the way he would have 3 days ago. Something about the room, about her, made demanding feel foolish now. "I own 61% of Sovereign Regent Group," Evelyn said finally. "I have for 3 years. Your mother's consulting position, Priya's job in the events division, neither of those existed before I acquired the company. I let them happen. I let your mother believe her connections had earned her the role. I let Priya believe her qualifications had earned her the hire. Neither of those things were entirely true, and neither of them were entirely false either. I simply never told either woman who was signing off on their onboarding paperwork." "Why?" Grant said, his voice hoarse, the first word he'd managed since sitting down. "Why would you do that? Why would you hide something like that from me for 4 years?" Evelyn considered the question with the same patience she gave every serious question, turning it over before answering. "Because the first 6 months we dated, you told me a story about a woman on your father's board who pushed back on an acquisition once, and you laughed when you told it, and you called her a headache in heels. I remember exactly where we were sitting. I remember exactly what I ordered that night, because I spent the rest of the dinner deciding never to let you know what I actually did for a living." Grant said nothing. He didn't remember the story. He believed her anyway. "I told myself it was strategy," Evelyn continued. "That I was protecting Halcyon, protecting the acquisition, keeping my professional life separate from a marriage that had nothing to do with it. That was true for a while. But somewhere in the last 2 years it stopped being strategy and started being a test. I wanted to see if you'd ever ask a real question. If you'd ever look at me closely enough to notice there was more beneath the surface than what you decided to see on our second date." "I never asked," Grant said quietly. "No," Evelyn agreed. "You never did." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had struck her 3 nights ago, and something in his chest, some old architecture of certainty his father had built in him decades ago, finally, quietly began to give way. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "I'm not asking you to fix it," Evelyn said. "I stopped needing you to fix anything the moment you decided a marble floor was an acceptable place to put your hand on me." She opened the folder at last and slid it across the table, not financial documents this time, but a single sheet, official letterhead, Nathaniel Cole's signature already affixed at the bottom. "This is a formal separation agreement. I've instructed my legal team to keep the proceedings private, procedural, and free of any public statement from Sovereign Regent regarding your mother's or Priya's employment status, provided you don't attempt to interfere with the compliance review already underway. That's the only condition." Grant stared at the document without picking it up. "And if I do interfere?" "Then the police report I filed Tuesday morning, along with the lobby security footage Sovereign Regent owns outright, becomes part of a public record instead of a private one," Evelyn said, her voice never rising, never sharpening, simply stating a fact the way she might state the weather. "I'd rather not do that, Grant. Not because I'm protecting you. Because I'm protecting myself from becoming a story people whisper about at parties instead of a woman who handled her own life competently. But I will do it if I have to. I want you to understand that clearly, right now, in this room, so we never have to have this conversation again." Grant's jaw tightened, the old reflex rising, the urge to argue, to reframe, to find some angle that restored the balance of power he'd assumed, without ever examining it, belonged naturally to him. He opened his mouth to speak. And then, for the first time in 4 years, he actually looked at her, really looked, the way he should have looked 5 years ago at that charity gala, and he saw, beneath the composure and the bruise and the careful stillness, a woman who had spent years quietly building an empire around the exact spot where he'd assumed her weakness lived. He closed his mouth. He picked up the pen instead. 3 floors below, in a corner office she wouldn't be using much longer, Priya Anand sat across from a compliance attorney and finally, after 2 hours of careful, lawyer-supervised silence, said the thing she'd been holding back since the boardroom. Grant knew, she said quietly, about the Larkspur contracts. Not the details, maybe, but he knew I was inflating vendor invoices. He told me it was fine, as long as it stayed small enough not to trigger an audit. He said, and I remember this exactly, that his wife doesn't pay attention to that side of the business. The attorney's pen stopped moving. Can you say that again, please, for the record? Upstairs, unaware, Grant Whitfield signed his name at the bottom of a separation agreement, believing, for one brief, mistaken moment, that the worst of what today would cost him had already happened. He had no idea it was only just beginning. The compliance attorney's report reached Nathaniel Cole's desk by 4 o'clock that afternoon, and by 5, it had reached Evelyn, who read it standing at her office window with the city already sliding into dusk, the same window from which, 3 days earlier, she'd looked out at a lit-up tower and thought about how little the people inside it actually knew about her. He told me it was fine, as long as it stayed small enough not to trigger an audit. He said his wife doesn't pay attention to that side of the business. Evelyn read the line twice, then set the report down carefully, as though it might bruise beneath her fingers the way she had bruised beneath his. You knew this was possible, Priyanka said gently, standing in the doorway. That it wasn't just Diane and Priya. I suspected, Evelyn said. Suspecting and reading it in someone else's sworn statement are different things. She turned from the window. Get Nathaniel. And pull everything we have on Grant's access to the building, every reservation, every card transaction, every after-hours entry. I want the full picture before he has any more time to build a version of events that doesn't include this. By the time Nathaniel arrived 20 minutes later, Evelyn had already laid the compliance report, the access logs, and the restaurant reservation pattern out across her desk in 3 neat, damning rows. He wasn't just careless, she said. He knew. Priya's statement puts a direct quote in his mouth. Doesn't pay attention to that side of the business. That's not ignorance, Nathaniel. That's a man who understood exactly what was happening and calculated that his wife was too disinterested or too stupid to ever find out. Nathaniel studied the report with his usual measured calm, though even he allowed himself a small, tight exhale. This changes the separation agreement significantly. If Grant had knowledge of fraudulent activity within a company he had no formal role in, activity that materially damaged Sovereign Regent's finances, that's not just a marital issue anymore. Depending on how deep the compliance team wants to dig, it's potential civil liability. Possibly more, if intent to conceal can be established. Can it be established? With Priya's statement corroborated? Nathaniel tapped the page. It's a start. It's not proof of a conspiracy, but it's proof he was told and chose silence. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the 3 rows of paper on her desk, a mother-in-law who'd spent a year fabricating client outings, a mistress who'd spent months skimming vendor contracts through her own sister's bank account, and now a husband who'd known about at least one of those schemes and said nothing, because saying something would have required admitting he'd noticed his wife's company closely enough to protect it. He signed the separation agreement this morning, she said finally, believing the worst was already behind him. Do you want to reopen the terms? Evelyn considered it, really considered it, weighing the version of herself that wanted to make Grant Whitfield feel, in some small, permanent way, exactly what it had cost her to stand in that lobby with an earring broken on the marble floor. Then she set that version aside, gently, the way she'd learned to set aside most impulses that offered satisfaction instead of strategy. No, she said. I don't want to punish him more than the facts require. I want the facts to speak for themselves, in the right order, to the right people. Draft an amendment. His knowledge of the Larkspur scheme gets included as a formal disclosure in the settlement, not to extract more from him financially, but to ensure Sovereign Regent's legal exposure is fully documented and protected. If he wants to contest that disclosure, he can explain to a judge why he told his mistress that his wife doesn't pay attention. Nathaniel almost smiled. That's a remarkably restrained response to being lied to on multiple fronts by every member of your husband's family. I'm not being restrained for his benefit, Evelyn said. I'm being restrained because restraint is what actually wins. Rage gets you a viral video and a sympathetic news cycle for a week. Documentation gets you everything you're actually owed, permanently, on the record, in a form nobody can argue with later. She closed the folder. Send the amendment to his attorney tonight. I want his signature on it before he has time to build a defense. Grant received the amended agreement at 8:15 that evening in the penthouse, alone, the city lights doing nothing to warm a room that had felt, for 3 days now, increasingly like a stage set for a life he no longer recognized as his own. He read the new clause twice, his stomach tightening with each pass. The undersigned acknowledges prior knowledge of fraudulent vendor practices conducted by Priya and within Sovereign Regent Group, and further acknowledges failure to disclose said knowledge to appropriate compliance authorities. He called Priya first, out of instinct, before he'd even finished reading the full page. She didn't pick up. He called again. Straight to voicemail this time, the flat, mechanical tone of a number that had been blocked. He sat down heavily on the edge of the same unmade bed he'd been sitting on 3 days earlier, when his mother had told him to send flowers, to smooth things over, to manage the story before it managed him. He understood now, with the particular clarity that only comes after every easier option has closed, that there had never been a version of this where he managed anything. Evelyn had been managing it, managing him, for years, quietly, patiently, waiting to see exactly how far he would go before she stopped pretending not to notice. His phone buzzed. Not Priya. His mother. They're saying I'll lose my consulting fee entirely if the review finds intent. Grant, I need you to talk to her. She listens to you. Please. Grant stared at the message for a long time before typing back 3 words that felt, even as he sent them, like the truest thing he'd said in years. She doesn't anymore. The following morning, Evelyn arrived at Sovereign Regent's headquarters to find David Okafor, the security lead from the lobby, quietly reassigned to corporate investigations at her request the day after the slap, waiting outside her office with an expression she'd learned, over 3 years of working with him, meant he'd found something worth interrupting her morning for. You said you wanted everything on Grant's access to the building, he said, holding out a tablet. There's something in the after-hours logs from 4 months ago I think you need to see before the review closes today. Evelyn took the tablet, scanned the entry David had highlighted, and felt something in her chest go very still, not the sharp, immediate sting of the lobby, but something slower, colder, the particular stillness of realizing a wound was deeper than she'd first assumed. The entry showed Grant's access card used to enter the 9th floor conference room, the very room where she'd sat with him yesterday, the room she used specifically for private conversations, at 11:47 p.m., 4 months before that dinner, 4 months before any of this began. He'd been in the building, in that room, long before she'd ever asked a single question at dinner. Pull the footage, Evelyn said quietly. All of it. I want to know exactly what he was doing in there, and who he was doing it with. The footage took David Okafor most of the morning to fully recover. The 9th floor conference room's camera system had been serviced 2 months prior, and the archived files sat buried in a backup server that hadn't been touched since. By 11, he was back at Evelyn's office door, tablet in hand, his expression careful in the way people's expressions get careful right before delivering something they know will land hard. You should sit down for this, he said. I've been sitting down for 3 days, David. Just show me. He set the tablet on her desk and pressed play. The footage was grainy, time-stamped in the corner, 11:47 p.m., 4 months earlier, and showed Grant Whitfield letting himself into the 9th floor conference room with his own building access card, alone at first, glancing back toward the hallway twice before closing the door behind him. 2 minutes later, a second figure entered. Not Priya. Not Diane. A man Evelyn recognized instantly, even in the poor lighting. Marcus Delaney, her own director of asset management. A man she'd personally hired 4 years ago. A man who reported directly to her, whose signature appeared on nearly every major acquisition Halcyon had made since. Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly, though she didn't move, didn't let her face show anything beyond the same stillness she'd worn since the lobby. On the recording, Grant and Marcus spoke for nearly 40 minutes, their voices too quiet for the audio to catch clearly, but body language telling its own story. Marcus handing over a folder, Grant flipping through it with the particular focus of a man reading something he understood mattered, Marcus glancing repeatedly toward the door like a man afraid of being seen. I need audio, Evelyn said. Whatever it takes. Compliance is already on it. It'll take a day, maybe two, to clean up. David hesitated. There's something else. I pulled Marcus Delaney's calendar for the past 6 months. He's had 11 private meetings logged as external consultation, no client name attached, no project code. All of them fall within a week of major Halcyon acquisition announcements. Evelyn sat back slowly. Marcus Delaney wasn't a peripheral employee. He sat 2 doors down from her own office. He'd helped structure the very holding company that had allowed her to acquire Sovereign Regent in secret. If Grant had been meeting with him for 4 months, then the question was no longer whether her husband had known about Priya's fraud. The question was whether he'd known about Halcyon itself long before that lobby, long before that dinner, and had let her believe, for months, that her ownership of the company was still her secret to reveal on her own terms. Get Marcus in here, she said. Before he has a chance to hear that we've pulled the footage. Marcus Delaney arrived at Evelyn's office 15 minutes later, his usual easy confidence noticeably thinner around the edges, though he masked it well enough that a less careful observer might have missed it entirely. You wanted to see me? Sit down, Evelyn said, and gestured to the chair across from her desk, the tablet already turned face down beside her, waiting. Marcus sat. Is this about the compliance review? I've read the reports on Priya Anand and Diane Whitfield. It's ugly, but I don't see how it touches my department. It doesn't, Evelyn said. This does. She turned the tablet over and pressed play. Marcus's face changed the moment the footage began. Not shock, exactly, but the particular, sinking recognition of a man who has spent months hoping a specific door would never open and has just watched it swing wide. Evelyn. For months ago, she said, cutting him off, her voice quiet and level in a way that somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have. 9th floor. 11:47 at night. You handed my husband a folder. I'd like to know what was in it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, some internal calculation playing out visibly across his face, weighing, Evelyn suspected, exactly how much she already knew against how much he could still control by controlling what he said next. He came to me, Marcus said finally. Not the other way around. He'd found some inconsistencies in a few property transfers, Sovereign Regent assets moving into Halcyon's holding structure, and he wanted to know whose company was actually acquiring them. He said he'd pay for the information. And you took his money. I told him it was structured through a series of trusts, Marcus said, avoiding a direct answer, which was, Evelyn understood immediately, its own kind of answer. I didn't tell him it was you. I want that on the record. I never told him your name. But you told him enough, Evelyn said. Enough that he understood his wife controlled something significant, without ever having the courage to ask me directly. Enough that he could keep pretending at dinner parties that I did something with numbers, while quietly gathering information he thought he could use against me eventually. Marcus said nothing, which confirmed everything. How much did he pay you? 15,000. Over 2 payments. Evelyn absorbed this in silence, feeling something cold and clarifying settle over the anger that had been building all morning. Not less anger, exactly, but anger reorganized into something more useful. Grant hadn't simply failed to ask questions about her life out of arrogance or disinterest, the way she'd assumed for years. He had actively, deliberately gone looking for the truth behind her back, paid for it, and then said nothing, not to confront her honestly, not to ask her directly what she'd built, but to hoard the information like a weapon he wasn't yet ready to use. Until the night he'd raised his hand instead. You're terminated, effective immediately, Evelyn said. Your severance will reflect gross misconduct, which means there won't be much of one. Legal will be in touch about the $15,000. Sovereign Regent's Council will want to know whether that constitutes a bribe under the terms of your employment contract, and I suspect they'll find that it does. Marcus stood slowly, his composure fully abandoned now. You're really going to do all this? Blow up your husband's family, fire people who've worked for you for years, over a slap? Evelyn looked at him steadily. I'm doing this because a slap was simply the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't already noticed everyone around me lying. You didn't create the lie, Marcus. You just decided it was profitable enough to keep. He left without another word, and Evelyn sat alone for a long moment afterward, staring at the frozen frame on the tablet, Grant's face, caught mid-sentence, for months younger, already, even then, keeping secrets from her while she'd been keeping her own. Her phone buzzed. Nathaniel. Grant's attorney just called. He wants to renegotiate the settlement. Says he has information that changes the terms in his favor. Should I take the meeting? Evelyn looked out the window at the tower across the skyline, gold light beginning to catch the glass as the afternoon wore on, and felt, for the first time since the lobby, something that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite anger, but sat somewhere sharp and certain between the two. Take the meeting, she typed back. Let him show his hand. I want to see exactly how far he's willing to go before he understands there's nothing left to negotiate.